Hi, this is Kate Warren, Executive Vice President at Devex, and thank you all for joining us today for our online event on creating resilient humanitarian teams. As maybe many of you have experienced, the psychological impact of COVID-19 pandemic on teams, and particularly humanitarians serving on the front lines, can be a real threat to our quality of work as well as our mental health. And for this reason, fostering team resilience is become just a really critical component to leadership. I think many of us have probably seen our teams really come together in this moment of crisis and operate at full tilt, and want to understand how we can leverage that momentum and carry it forward, but also might be seeing some real toll on our teams and their ability to weather what can be challenging times. So today we're going to be talking with Jason Ighani, who I'm very pleased is joining us. He's a team development specialist with over 10 years of experience. He's worked extensively in the international development in humanitarian fields in the area of leadership development and team effectiveness. So he has a unique expertise in supporting the design and development of humanitarian leadership teams. He's the co-founder of KITE, a global consulting firm dedicated to elevating the practice and discourse of team leadership within the humanitarian and development space. And he's also the founder and CEO of the Humanitarian Coaching Network, a global community of coaches that provides large-scale individual and group coaching support for humanitarian staff, particularly those serving in the most isolated and complex duty stations. So Jason brings a wealth of experience and expertise with us today. So Jason, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Kate, for the introduction, and welcome colleagues to the session. We're here to explore the idea of team resilience and to see how that might be incorporated more intentionally in the way our teams function. It's a tremendously important topic, I believe, and as Kate rightly said, the psychological impact of COVID, I think, is as much a systemic issue as the spread of the illness. I'd like to actually ask how many of you are team leaders? How many of you are managing teams currently? And this question, the question that I'm about to ask, or the couple questions are really specifically directed towards you. And Kate, since I have you face to face, I can use you as kind of a more immediate sounding board. But the first question that I'd like to ask all of you is, if you were to give me a percentage that represented your, let me rephrase that question. What percentage of your team's collective performance would you attribute to your leadership? So think about the entirety of what your team, the people that report to you, that work with you, deliver, and think about the percentage of that you would attribute directly to your leadership. If you like to throw your answer in the Q&A box, feel free. But Kate, just in the meantime, I know that you are that you lead teams in your organization. If you were to answer that question, what would your answer be?
Yeah, no, it's a very thought-provoking question. You know, I probably would say 50%. You know, I think we have very talented teams, and so definitely want to give credit to the capacities and capabilities of our team members. So yeah, I'll say, but maybe half.
Half, okay. Great. So I haven't seen any other answers come in. So I'll just continue the line of inquiry with you. If I were to ask that same question to the members of your team, how much of the collective performance of the team would they attribute to your leadership? What would that percentage be?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That's one I might need to ask. Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe I feel like it might be the same.
The same.
Yeah.
Great. So again, no answers from the audience as of yet. Now, what would you say? So that was you gave your answer. You said 50%. You would attribute 50%. You'd say that your staff would probably have a similar answer. What would your guess be of most? What is probably the average answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think assuming sometimes people don't want to have a lot of ego and probably maybe attribute more to their teams, but then team members, maybe the leaders not recognizing how maybe critical their leadership is, maybe attribute more to their leaders would be my hypothesis. Okay,
great. And we have one answer from Kurt that says 20%. In fact, when we ask this question to team leaders, the average answer is roughly 15 to 20%. Mm-hmm. When we ask them what their team perceives their role or their impact as, typically it's much higher. So in other words, what you're seeing is a bit of a disconnect between what the leader believes they are actually able to impact and what the people around them, both their team and more broadly in the organization, expect of them. And this is actually a phenomenon that has been studied and documented. And there is even a phrase that has been used there's a coined phrase that is leader attribution error. It is the attributional impulse to give the leader more credit and responsibility and expectation than they actually deserve. And a lot of times the reasoning behind the leader rating themselves, not rating themselves, but attributing a lesser percentage is because they're aware of the organizational constraints, the external pressures that really limit how much they as an individual leader can do. The reality is that performance in teams is much more directly correlated with the strength of the team than it is the strength of the leader. And part of the research that I'll be sharing with you today comes from an extensive body of research over 2 decades conducted by Richard Hackman and Ruth Wagman on the conditions that allow teams to be effective. And one of the things that they found in their research is that the most critical condition for a team to perform well is the extent to which the team has been clearly designed to function as a team. Colleagues, I'll pose another question. You don't have to answer because I'll give you the answer really quickly. But of all the leadership teams that I have coached over the past 1.5 years, I want you to guess how many of these teams have actually gone through the process of designing themselves as interdependent collective units of work. What percentage of the 20 to 30 teams do you think have actually gone through the process of designing themselves as a team? I'm loving the answers, Kurt. Kurt says 10%. Colleagues, 0 of these teams have actually gone through the process of designing themselves as a team. And I'll explain more about what I mean by that. But essentially what it comes down to is that what the groups that call themselves teams, that call themselves leadership teams, the groups that are looked towards to be the driving force of the programmatic delivery and the internal management of the office, have not gone through the exercise of creating an aligned understanding of what they are collectively accountable for. They are very clear about their individual roles within the team, but there exists a huge gap in the clarity of understanding and the alignment of the understanding of the members on what are we responsible for as a unit. What is not possible for the office? What is the value that is lost if we do not come together and collaborate on these specific areas? This is perhaps one of the most important elements of team design, and this is, by and large, absolutely absent in most of the teams that we work with. Is this clear, Kate? Is this coming across?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's interesting.
Great. I'd like to just share, just on that note, share some slides with you, and these are really just to consolidate some of the concepts and the information that I'm sharing. So we'll pull those up shortly. So I want you to look at this graph and highlight the fact that this is taken from one team in particular, but it is, I would say, representative of most of the teams that we work with in KITE, and how the vast majority of the time that teams spend together is really just sharing information. So it is not being spent on collective work. It is not being spent on strategic alignment. It is really spent, for the most part, in sharing updates. Updates which, for the most part, when we engage team members in reflection on this, are not particularly relevant to their work. It is time consuming, it is tiresome, and it does not address the most critical areas of work. And yet, in the absence of a clear team design, this is often the pattern that we see. I am curious how many of you notice this pattern in your own teams. I'm curious how many of you notice the amount of time spent purely on report outs rather than on collective work and joint decisions. So this is just one of the signs, the most common signs that we see in our diagnostic work that shows the gap around team design. And if you go to the next slide on the presentation, we talked about I referenced the research that was conducted by Richard Hackman and Ruth Wagman. And their inquiry, their search was to understand what conditions would predict team effectiveness. And this is where we begin to touch on really the theme of today's session. Ruth Wagman and Richard Hackman identified that highly effective teams did not reduce team effectiveness. We're not just effective because they got the work done. This is what we refer to as task performance. This is typically, when we think about effectiveness, the first thing that comes to mind. Are we able to meet or even exceed the expectations of our clients and stakeholders? What they observed is that the highest performing teams not only did the work, but they also had clearly established processes and structures to ensure that the well-being of the team members was also established, that the well-being and the resilience of the members was established. So they did the work, they cared for each other, and they learned as they went. There were certain practices that they established in the way that the team operated that allowed them not only to do the work they were currently doing in the moment well, and to sustain each other in that process, but also to gradually increase the collective intelligence of their team. And this is a critical aspect of team resilience, that when faced with unexpected complexity and adversity, the team is able to pivot and innovate and respond in an agile way and rebound from that adversity or that complexity in a timely manner. And so I share this because I want to make sure that when we think about team effectiveness, we're thinking about this holistically, not just in terms of results, but also in terms of the practices and processes and structures that we establish to protect the well-being of our teams and to ensure its continuity, as well as to expand our capacity to manage an increasing level of complexity. Kate, any reactions to this?
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think that, at least in my vantage point of Devex and working with different organizations, that team well-being and resilience is something that has been more recently paid attention to, and that organizations are starting to think about and put resources behind. So I'd love to hear your advice on what organizations can do that maybe feel like they haven't addressed that in their workplaces to the level they should, and maybe are being confronted with the reality of that right now, given the current crisis and climate, but ways that they can think about how they can integrate those systems and processes into the work they're doing.
It's a great question, and we'll move on to that to the very next slide. My best friend Kurt, my new best friend Kurt, is asking whether the quality of group process is related to the unity of the group members. And I'll say that, unity is an interesting question. And I think it kind of relates to an assumption that it is the quality of the interpersonal relationships of a team that leads to its effectiveness. And whereas that is a really important quality, what I find more than anything is that a lot of the interpersonal tensions that exist within teams have more to do with a lack of clarity in the design of the team than it does with how much people like each other. So there are many teams that are very united in kind of in an interpersonal way. They are bonded in a way, have great feelings of fondness for each other, not particularly effective at doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so the quality of group process is actually more referring to the way in which a team invests in reflecting on the way it's working and learns how to function better and to innovate in the course of its work. It becomes a liability for a team. And the more complex the work that a team does, the more liability it is to simply focus on the immediate task at hand. There has to be a constant dialogue with the external reality that we're responding to and the emergent needs that we're seeing. So I hope that answered your question, Kurt. So before we respond to the very practical question that you posed, Kate, it's just important to state that what Hackman and Wagman's research pointed to was that the design of a team accounts for 60 to 70% of a team's effectiveness. If you design a team well, you are doing the most, that is the most critical contribution to whether a team will perform well or not. The 30 to 40% of a team's effectiveness has to do with the extent to which you launch the team well. In other words, the extent to which that design becomes clearly articulated to the team, to which that design is refined and aligned around, and then is kind of used then as a frame of reference for the work moving forward. Only 10% of a team's effectiveness can be really linked to skillful coaching. And I think that a lot of people would think that it's actually the other way around, that coaching is kind of the means by which a team can become more effective. And truthfully, I think that if a team is not designed well, coaching on our interpersonal relationships, on our communication, on our strategy can actually serve as a distraction. Because the fundamental clarity that is needed for the team to organize itself around the critical areas of work has often not taken place. And so this is kind of the hierarchy of needs, if you will, for the conditions for team effectiveness. So moving on to the question that you posed, Kate, about what are some of the concrete things that teams can do to ensure that they're not only being effective at what they do, but also fostering resilience within their teams. We'll see in the next slide. Perhaps the concept that I'd like to emphasize more than anything else is a resilient, effective team is a team that is clearly designed. And these are some of the essential questions that I'd like to leave you with. This is like the practical guide for beginning to articulate the elements of your team's design. And before I get to that, I want to reference something that we discussed at the beginning of the session. Leader attribution error is not a statement on the value or not of the leader. Leaders matter without a question of a doubt. It is not saying that they do not matter. It is much more about getting very clear and precise about what the unique contribution, the most impactful contribution of a leader is. Being the autocratic, visionary, hierarchical head of a group is a concept, is a model of leadership that I think has long outlived its usefulness. And what we're seeing is the most critical contribution of a leader is in bringing clarity to the team's design. If you are a team leader, oversight, direction, setting establishing a clear strategy, being the decision maker, these are things that, yes, may have value, but in more and more effective teams, what we're seeing is that a lot of those things are becoming the collective responsibility of teams. But where the unique contribution of a leader is particularly felt is in, before the team even is convened, ensuring that a clear design is in place. And so the first question that we're asking in going through the exercise of team design is, are we a real team? Colleagues, collaboration for collaboration's sake can be one of the most frustrating and tiresome things that we can engage in. We have all, I think, I'm guessing many of us have been on part of committees and groups where everybody knows they could be more easily done, that the task could be more easily completed by just giving it to the most competent person in the space. And so the first question that we have to ask is the nature of the work interdependent? Is the nature of the work that, or is some of the work that needs to be done collaborative in nature? And so the first question, again, is, are we interdependent? Are we interdependent in our work? If we are not, let's not be a team. Let's just do our work really, really well individually. But if we are interdependent, if we recognize that there are certain things that simply cannot be done unless we are engaging in an ongoing way, then a team is necessary. If we recognize that we're interdependent, then we need to be extremely clear about and aligned in what our collective purpose is. And I am not referring to purpose as some aspirational vision. I'm talking specifically about these are the areas of collective work that call our team into existence. It's not what we want to be doing. It's not what we feel comfortable in doing. It is the external needs of our clients, of our stakeholders, of our beneficiaries that this team is uniquely positioned to respond to. Once we are clear in what this team exists to do, that is not the same also with the mission of the organization. This is often a confusion that we find, that a leadership team will often define its purpose as the purpose of the office or the purpose of the organization, and that is not the case. The purpose of the leadership team will naturally be much more specific and concrete. But once that purpose is clear, the question that then follows is, do we have the right people? And by right people, we're talking concretely about, do we have the right blend of technical skill and interpersonal maturity to work well together? And do we have enough diversity within the team to ensure that all the critical voices, all the voices that are relevant to our work, are acknowledged and incorporated? We find that teams that are technically skilled, that possess a lot of technical skill, but lack the interpersonal maturity, are the ones that very quickly devolve into work silos that we are all very familiar with. The lack of technical skill, it is clear the work simply cannot be done. And so it needs to be flagged sooner rather than later, because if not, the team will just die a slow death. And teams that lack diversity often, and there is such a thing as being a team being too diverse or disparate in its perspectives. But what is often the case are teams being too homogenous, and therefore certain critical realities being overlooked because of the lack of that diversity. Lastly, we are clear about our purpose. We have the right people. There are certain processes, and this directly relates, Kate, to the question around team resilience. Are we clear about how we make decisions together? Are we clear about how we manage conflict when it arises? Are we clear about how we're going to assess our performance as a team and what feedback we elicit from our stakeholders and clients to determine the value of our work? And are we clear about how we are going to support each other in our work and in our emotional experience when traversing through difficult and intense times? One of the most practical examples of this is the practice of debriefing. It is very interesting to me that in most of the teams or groups that I observe and work with, they're very good at presenting what they've done or what they're doing. There is very rarely a culture within teams to share what we are experiencing and what we are feeling, what we are observing and noticing, not just in our team, but in the broader system that we're a part of. And this very simple practice of not only reporting out on our work, but on our experience, can be a powerful way of mitigating the isolation and the feelings of overwhelm that often affect teams, particularly ones serving in the most complex settings. I'm going to stop here to get both reactions from the group as well as from you, Kate.
Yeah, great. And feel free, anyone, to chime in the Q&A chat. So yeah, a couple questions for me on my end. And what advice do you have for groups? You have your team, the people are set, there's not a lot of flexibility to change that, but how you could apply this process to your current team situation, recognizing that maybe if you do see that you have a lack of diversity or skills, maybe there is an immediate fix to that, but ways that you could still try to incorporate some of this thinking into how you become a better and more effective team?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that it's a difficult one to answer when teams don't really have the autonomy or the flexibility to, in a timely way, incorporate new members or replace members or whatnot. First and foremost, I think the conversation is important. Acknowledging that we lack certain critical technical skills in our team, I think is an important starting point. Because once we can acknowledge that, we can more compassionately and objectively talk about the areas where we're failing. And I'm sure that this will not be, those failures, if you will, or those difficulties will not be pervasive. They may be, related to certain specific areas. But I think that even if a team cannot really change its membership, it creates the opening for a conversation around, okay, what consultant might we bring in for a temporary time to fill that skill gap while we bolster our capacity in these specific ways. That is particularly important when the amount of time that it would take us to develop those skills is just far greater than what we can afford to take. There are some cases in which certain skill gaps can be addressed in the course of our work. And so the whole conversation around, do we have the right people, allows us to be more thoughtful and intentional about what it is that it actually needs to be done, as opposed to just kind of avoiding that conversation, which can be quite confrontational and difficult, and just kind of moving, hoping that it'll all work out. In the research that Hackman and Wegman did, they made it very clear that being a real team, having a compelling and clear purpose, and having the right people are essential conditions. A team does not perform if those conditions are not in place. And so, I think, I think does that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, and you think about particularly of a humanitarian context where maybe the reality of the situation is rapidly changing, and maybe those needs are changing. How you can manage such a dynamic experience like that with a more static team.
Yeah, I will also add that a lot of times the reason why right people is an important question to ask as soon as possible, in fact, ideally before you even have a team, is so that you can really choose people based on their expertise rather than just their position. A lot of leadership teams just default to saying, well, the heads of section are naturally part of this team. And it may be the case that not all of those heads of section are the right people to be a part of the team, partly because their work may not be particularly related to the others, and so they can just kind of operate in a more independent way, much more effectively. But also it's true that not everybody that is in a leadership position has the aptitude or the capacity to collaborate well. And so what you want is to think about the composition of the team and not just default to the organizational hierarchy to determine who needs to be on the team, because it may very well be that there is a program assistant who happens to have the exact skill set that is needed for certain decisions to be made during a critical time in the process. And so teams, particularly leadership teams, having the fluidity to having the wherewithal to notice what are the skills within our office that we can leverage and kind of fill certain gaps, as well as the humility to invite that additional perspective into their space, regardless of seniority or role.
Yeah, no, definitely important. So your best friend Kurt has a question. Said, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the launch part, given it contributes 30% towards the team's effectiveness. And what does that entail? And if done inadequately, how best can we relaunch?
Yeah, it's a great question, as always, Kurt. Thank you. And you use a term that we actually use quite frequently in our work at KITE. Most of our work is relaunching teams, not launching them. Ideally, the conversation of team design is not happening 2 years down the road of a team working together. Ideally, it's happening at the beginning of the team's life cycle. But a launch is really, ideally, it is about the team leader giving some very deep thoughts to what this team is needed for. What are the needs, the programmatic needs, the needs in terms of the organizational culture that this group is uniquely equipped to address as a collective. Sharing that purpose, that team purpose with the team, and refining it so that people can really own that purpose and see themselves as a part of it. The last question on the slide that I was reviewing before is really what we call about, these are team norms. How we manage conflict, how we make decisions. It is important for the questions that we asked, that all of those areas are clearly defined. It is risky for a team not to have a clear conversation about how it's going to manage conflict within its group, or how decisions that involve not just the members here, but also the wider office are going to be made. These are really critical conversations, but also the team norms are unique expressions of what that team values and what has them at their best. And so a really important conversation during a launch or a relaunch is, what are the norms that are going to guide our interactions and the way that we manage our work? And so it's about really making what is often implicit in a team as explicit as possible, knowing that in the course of the work you will have to refine, you will have to adjust. But yes, purpose, norms, these are the two of the critical purpose, right people, norms, really critical conversation to have during the launch. I will say that in the relaunch, a lot of times what we have the opportunity to do is we have an opportunity to deploy a team diagnostic, which is something that the team can debrief together and use as fodder for that conversation.
Yeah, and so we have another question that came in, and that might be what you would advise in this situation. But so we rarely have the ability to design teams from scratch. We often inherit our teams. So how do we address the needs in that situation? So do you think framing it more in kind of that relaunch is effective, or any other advice for somebody in that situation?
Yes, thank you, Roy. That is very true. It's something that I think, Kate, your question earlier was asking about. In terms of designing the membership of the team from scratch, yes, that is often it is not possible. A lot of you inherit your teams. That does not make the conversation around the purpose of the team, the specific lines of collective action that are needed, the specific accountabilities within the team, and the norms that will guide its interaction any less valuable. I think, Roy, to your question, I think those are the conversations that you're focusing on, rather than do we have the right people, or can we change that? I think that in those cases it's much more difficult to have that conversation. But like I said, it is an opportunity to take stock and say, do we believe, given the purpose that we have the right skill set currently to deliver on that? Are we confident in our ability to meet those needs? And if we are not, maybe we look beyond the people here present, both internally or externally, to meet that gap in an ongoing or in a temporary way. Yeah.
And you see coaching playing a part? And I know you pointed out that there's some things that aren't easily or quickly coached, particularly when it comes to technical expertise, but do you see that as a part of helping to reorient your teams and build some of those skills that might be identified as missing?
Yeah. Like I said, I think that as someone who works as a team coach, oftentimes when I talk about team design and team development, I don't really sell my services particularly well, because the reality is that if a team leader designs their team well, the need for ongoing coaching is significantly less than when that design is absent. But once a team has gone through the design process, once they have a high degree of alignment in terms of the work that needs to be done and agreement around how they're going to operate, the value of a team coach can be extremely high in helping that team maximize process gains and minimize process losses. The ability to consult effectively as a group is an absolute art. And those of us who have experienced a really vibrant, dynamic consultation know that really it often happens when there is a high degree of familiarity and trust in that group. It is very, very difficult to achieve that degree of fluidity and co-creation in a team that is recently formed or has a lot of unpleasant history behind it. And so a team coach can help begin to refine the team's capacity to consult, make decisions, address the unspoken and the unexamined assumptions that are present within the group. And so a lot of times our coaching work is not separate from the work of the team. It's actually as observers of the team's process, as providers of feedback to the team, and helping the team hold itself accountable, not only to its objectives, but also to the values that underlie their norms. And so I think, again, the design is critical, but the support of a skillful coach that understands your context and can accompany you through those critical early stages is invaluable. Yeah.
We have another question in from Robert. Could you explain what elements make for a successful debrief? Says, I've been a planner for 50 years, but recently had 2 consulting experiences marred by bad debriefing experiences. Some more advice on that.
It's a great question. There is, I think probably one of the most powerful and successful examples of debriefing that we can take are actually the form of group process that a lot of 12-step programs implement. And they're very clear principles that create the necessary safety for those debriefs to be effective. Debrief is a review of an experience. And so it is not about, I think when Robert, when you say an experience marred by bad debrief, what comes to mind is when a debrief becomes a debate as to whether or not an experience is valid. And a quality of a good debrief is one that takes place with a firm commitment from all participants that every single voice must be heard and valued and honored, that each of our experiences is valid, that we are not debriefing for the sake of coming to a unified understanding of what's happening, but more to hear the voices within our system and thus make a more inclusive and integrative assessment of where we are. This, I think, is the quality of a resilient system. A system that does not take into consideration all of its essential component parts and consider them as equally valuable and worthy of attention is a system ultimately that will crack under pressure. And so I think that is what I would highlight. I think that it is the way that we address and are able to hold the multiple experiences within a team as equally valid.
That's great. Yeah, we've integrated something even at Devex that we learned from our product team that a lot of technology teams do, called a retrospective. So at the end of a project or assignment, everyone comes together and you're sharing what worked well and what didn't work well, and all team members can then vote on those top key issues that we want to dig into to learn and figure out how we can do better. And having that safety is so important, right? Because you want people to feel like you can admit failures, and it's not in a way to assign blame, but really it's how can we learn from these and do better. And we found that to be an effective, I guess, framework for having those conversations in a way that does feel safe for people to admit what might feel a little scary.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that you're doing that, and just in a very concrete way, if I may offer to the participants. One question is, what am I experiencing? What am I noticing? What am I feeling? Another really necessary question is, what am I hearing from the group? I think both of those are really critical perspectives to bring into any debrief, because at the end of the day, it is not just about asserting your own experience. It is about using that experience to refine our understanding of what our team is needed, what is needed in our team. Yeah.
So we have another question here. Is the team diagnostic, which you referred to, a particular tool that can be shared and adapted to different situations, or is it more of a complex process?
So both. I think that the assessment process that we carry out with teams involves many different components. There's an extensive process of aligning with the team leader. There are interviews with the team members and critical stakeholders. We do use a tool called the Team Diagnostic Survey. You can read about that tool on 6teamconditions.com. This is the website that was created by Ruth Wagman and a dear colleague, Dr. Christopher Lowe. Dr. Ruth Wagman and Dr. Christopher Lowe. And it is the assessment based on the research that the late Richard Hackman and Ruth Wagman conducted out of Harvard over 20 years across a variety of different teams. So this is the tool that we use as kind of the starting point for our relaunches with teams. And just to the last statement, team effectiveness, a more resilient humanitarian action team, absolutely. I think that is, I think, I hope to be a really key takeaway from this conversation, that if we are not intentionally fostering resilience, we can assume that it will not naturally be supported within the team. Good collaboration, and this is something that Dr. Hackman was famous for saying. He says, I have no doubt that that brilliant collaboration is possible in a team, but don't count on it. And what he was kind of referring to was, just by getting brilliant, well-meaning, competent people together does not necessarily lead to effective collaboration. Some of the most frustrating experiences of collaboration I've had have been with some of the most brilliant and intelligent people. what allows for effective collaboration is when collaboration is clearly designed. And so that design needs to address the work. It needs to address the other parts of us, because they are being impacted. They have always been impacted. They are being impacted even more so, given the restrictions, the constraints, the uncertainties, the complexities that the current pandemic has introduced.
For sure. And just one more question here on measuring team effectiveness. What is your advice on, there's KPIs, there's OKRs, there's a lot of different methods that teams and organizations use to measure the impact and effectiveness of them. What advice do you have on how to measure that?
There are many ways, and I think that this is, again, one of the really important conversations that each team needs to ask itself. I would say that one of the things that is often lacking is we are not evaluating performance based on the feedback of our most critical beneficiaries, partners, and stakeholders. A lot of the feedback that is coming to us is coming internally. Our supervisor is evaluating our performance. Our peers are evaluating our performance. But we are not, there is very, very rarely, at least I have not really seen any clear way within the organizations that I work with for collective performance to be recognized and evaluated. And very few mechanisms for really entering into a frank and open conversation with the people that we're trying to be of service to determine whether or not what we're doing is actually making a difference. Unfortunately, a lot of the ways that we're measuring our success is whether we're hitting organizational goals. And there's a critical perspective missing there. Because ultimately, a team should be created to respond to an external need, not because it conforms to an organizational chart. And so the voices of our stakeholders, I think, is the most important one to take into consideration.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Well, I know we're getting kind of close to the end here. So what would be your advice, Jason, for our listeners today on something they can take back to their work and their organizations, to their teams, and what they should do to get started on thinking about how they could relaunch or redesign or rethink their teams with this framework?
Yeah, there is I would guess that in the vast majority of your teams, a conversation around your design, about making the implicit explicit, about aligning around certain critical collective goals and lines of action, of articulating how you can support each other to be at your best, and to know that is not an extra, it is not a bonus, it is actually integral to the work of an effective team. Any conversation along those lines will make you better. And enlisting the support of someone to have that conversation, to help you have that conversation, is also a really valuable investment of time. The work that you all are doing, I'm assuming, is way too important to leave to chance. And the absence of a design conversation, in my experience, is leaving success up to chance. It's leaving certain value up to happenstance. And often it's not that good work isn't done. It's that certain things that require your alignment don't get done. So that conversation is really critical. Having that design conversation is really critical. Asking for support to have it, absolutely critical. I can speak for our company, KITE. KITE was not created to coach 1 million teams. KITE was created to support organizations in approaching collaboration in a more coherent, research-based way. So anything that we can do to help that conversation, to elevate that conversation in your organizations, we are happy to do. And budgetary constraints should not get in the way of that. It's way too important and urgent not to make that happen. So have the conversation, and if you need it, ask for help. That's probably the two last things I'd say.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know. I mean, there's a lot going on in the world right now, and that I think is really pushing teams and their resilience from COVID to, you and I are both in the U.S. where we have a lot of unrest happening right now, and some really important conversations on race and racism, and that is certainly very much present in international development, despite us believing we're all in this for doing good. There definitely is a lot of work to be done. So hopefully some of the ideas and best practices you shared can also be helpful as teams are thinking about how to better design and support their teams, given all of the reality that we're living in right now. So thank you, Jason, for taking the time to spend with us today. And thank you for everyone who tuned in and asked questions. If you are interested in digging into this topic a bit further, please check out the other events in our series on the new normal about supporting teams and organizations right now on Devex. I'm also hosting a video series on careers during COVID. On Thursday, I'll be speaking with the Momentum CEO, Dr. Christine Snow, on how the pandemic is impacting development work, the organizations that they work with. And on June 17th, we will be hosting another online event on job hunting during the time of COVID. So for anyone who might be looking for a job change, please look out for invitations for that event. As valued members of Devex, thank you for joining us today. Please do let us know what other topics you're interested in hearing about. We definitely want to make sure that we're providing the kind of information that's going to be most useful to you. And then thanks again, Jason, and everyone else. I hope everyone stays safe and healthy and has a good rest of their day.
Thank you all. Have a good day.